Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 6 Kata. Hoke staggered backward. His head rang as his vision went red. A young Ka warrior stood before him. His gloved fists were cocked back, ready to throw another punch. He furiously shouted at Hoke in his native tongue. Kata! Again, said Hoke, shaking his head. I don't know what the fuck you're saying, mate. Kata! Again shouted the Ka. The call was immediately taken up by a small group that had encircled the pair of combatants. The varied colors of their armor shined and glinted in the morning sunlight. Soon cries of Kata! Kata! filled the air. Hoke was caught between confusion and anger. He didn't understand their words, but their intention was clear. He was being tested. You, Kata! Shouted Hoke as he pointed to his opponent across the circle. The man's red mantis armor sparkled with iridescence in the light as he circled the Farron. The crowd howled as the Ka warrior darted forward, again lashing out with his fists. Hoke sidestepped the man, catching his wrist while simultaneously sweeping the man's leg. Hoke twisted with the Ka, holding fast to the warrior's wrist as the red-armored man lost his balance and tumbled to the ground. Hoke cantilevered the warrior's elbow against his leg, painfully hyperextending the joint as the Ka howled in agony. Hoke kept pressure on the hold for another moment before releasing the man and stepping away. He raised his arms as he shouted at the assembled warriors. Anybody else? A pair of warriors in green silently emerged from the small crowd and helped their fallen comrade to his feet. He again spoke as they passed the Farron. Kata. Hoke watched them walk away. Should have seen it coming, he thought to himself as he shook his head and wiped blood from his lip. They had been traveling with the Ka for 2 days. Galen wished to personally present them and the news of their victory over Zaren's army to the Monmotavi Kaluka Unka in Karasdin. Beyond his mission to find the verdant valleys, Hoke's duty as an envoy entreated him to accompany Eric to the Ka capital. It had been many years since diplomatic contact had been made between Terransay and Karasdin. Such an opportunity could not be set aside. The Ka had immediately accepted Eric. Reverent whispers of Alik, the Ka word for unscarred, could be heard as the young chosen passed. It was one of the few Ka words that Hoke didn't need Hawk to translate. The older Ka warriors treated Hoke with respect, but the younger warriors watched the Farron's every move like cats eyeing their prey, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Earlier that morning, Hoke had expressed interest in accompanying Galen's advance scouts. He was confident in his skill set and believed the Ka would allow him a modicum of respect once they saw him as not just a Farron, but a ranger of Terransay. Hoke shook his head at the fallacy. Separated from Eric and Galen, the Farron proved too tempting a target to resist, and what began as mere tension between Hoke and some of Galen's younger warriors had quickly spiraled into violence. They hadn't come bearing steel. Hoke knew they didn't intend to kill him, only to test his mettle. And by the old gods he wouldn't be found lacking. He gritted his teeth in annoyance as he contemplated how many more of these challenges lay ahead. "You acquitted yourself quite adequately just now," said a voice from behind him. Hoke turned to find Kasich leaning against his staff. "You're Galen's chirurgeon." "And you're the Unscarred's pet Farron," replied Kasich. Hoke made to protest when the old Ka's lined face split into a broad smile. He raised his hands to show he meant no offense. "Not my words, Hoke, but those of your friend Daleth, from back there," said Kasich, referring to the brief fight. "Of course," said Hoke. "Kata means pet," he asked the old Ka. Kasich nodded. "Spoken as an insult. They mean to say that you require the care of others." Hoke scoffed, but Kasich cut him off before the Farron could retort. "Know that Daleth and his friends are new to their armor. A Ka that pursues the warrior's path must win that armor in a battle to the death. Daleth isn't the first young buck to let his new rank goad him into fractious behavior," said Kasich. Hoke rubbed his jaw. "Fractious behavior, huh?" Kasich sighed. "I've never seen Daleth lose a match, let alone so quickly. If the boy had any sense, he'd feel the change in the wind and let it go. But I wouldn't bet on it." "I have Galen's countenance," said Hoke. Kasich laughed darkly. "Oh, they wouldn't risk his wrath, especially now." Hoke sighed in relief. "I'm not looking for a fight, but I don't run from them. If they leave me alone, I can return the courtesy." "Bah! They're a pack of pups measuring cocks," said the old Ka. "But even pups can draw blood if backed into a corner." Hoke understood the meaning behind the man's words. "And I've backed him into a corner?" "Daleth was just handed his first defeat, in front of his peers, and by a bloody Farron to boot." Kasich shook his head. "He's in a corner, all right." "You're saying this isn't over," said Hoke. Kasich fixed the Farron with a stern gaze. "Did it feel over?" Hoke again clenched his jaw in irritation. He'd been fighting his entire life. If these pups, as Kasich called them, wished to test him further, he'd be ready to meet them in kind. "Why are you telling me all of this?" asked Hoke. Kasich sighed. "You stood shoulder to shoulder with the Unscarred on our day of victory against the butchers of my people. I know the difference between an enemy and an ally." Hoke nodded in understanding. "You're from Taransay?" asked Kasich, pulling Hoke from his brooding reverie. "That's right," said Hoke. Kasich smiled. "Did you know our peoples were once as one? The seeds of Taransay were carried from Charos Fen. There's a chance we're distant kin. You've certainly the height of a Ka." Hoke nodded and smiled in return. "I was raised on those stories and remember them well. Growing up in the house of Kalan," he paused to consider his words, "we were never far from our history." "Kalan?" asked Kasich, a look of shock on his face. "You are of the house of Kalan?" Hoke again nodded. Kasich laughed aloud. "Then you truly are among your kin, Hoke. Kalan may have left Charos Fen, but her family remained." "And her line has endured?" asked Hoke in disbelief. Kasich cocked his head as though chasing a stray thought. "Any Ka in this camp could claim distant relation. The people of Charos Fen are her clan, after all. But direct bloodline? Only one," said Kasich, holding up a single finger. "And you have his countenance." Hoke was shocked. He had indeed grown up on stories of his legendary ancestor, but he had never heard tell of blood relatives among the Ka of Charos Fen. How could this have been hidden, he asked himself. Hoke respectfully thanked Kasich for their conversation before returning to his tent. Seating himself cross-legged on the floor, he turned his sight inward and stepped into the room within his mind. The familiarity of the space always helped to soothe his mind when he had serious matters to ponder. He sank heavily into his chair and looked across the room to Hawk's closed door. His twin sister had been busy of late with matters in Taransay. As heiress to the power of Kalan, Hawk carried responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. Hoke felt a swelling of pride and admiration in his chest when he considered Hawk. She was the most brilliant person he knew. By the age of 12, she had outshone the masters of the Conclave and earned her title of heiress. Hawk was a wild talent, the likes of which hadn't been seen in Taransay in several generations. She was known by all and carried rank with her title, yet preferred to spend her time in solitude among the tower's many libraries. At one time, Hoke had walked that same path. He'd been raised as a scholar. It was never intended that he should learn the ways of the sword, but fate, it seemed, had other plans for the young Farron. before. Hoke walked along the deserted corridor. He felt empty and alone. Pausing mid-stride, he fell against the wall. The stones were welcoming and cool to the touch. He slid down the wall, his robes piling around him, making him look more like a pile of laundry than a heartbroken 10-year-old boy. Hoke and Hawk had spent the better part of the last 12 months immersed in the study of the mystic arts. Every aspect, theory, runes, spellcraft, augmentations, the beginnings of a fully rounded education in magic. While Hawk had taken to the training like a fish to water, Hoke had found himself struggling. Those waters had become a raging sea of whitecaps for Hoke, continually washing over him as he desperately tried to keep his head above the turbulent waves. But it was all over now. Since going through the soul-bonding enchantment, Hoke had been unable to perform the simplest of spells. There was no point in furthering the boy's magical education, he'd overheard his tutors telling his father. The growing sound of footfalls upon the stone floor betrayed the approach of Hoke's father, Ordwak. Hoke sat up straight and hastened to wipe his tear-stained cheeks, but too late. "Crying," hissed Ordwak as he surveyed his son. "Your weakness really has no limit, does it, Hoke?" Hoke said nothing as he stared at the floor. His father continued. "My firstborn," said Ordwak in a tone dripping with disapproval. "Have you any clue how this makes me look? My children were to be the greatest bonded pair that Terransay had ever known. Do you understand how this reflects upon our family?" Hoke gritted his teeth and stared daggers into the floor as his sorrow began to boil into a seething rage. Ordwak began to pace as Hoke sat in silence. "How could my blood produce such ineptitude?" asked Ordwak incredulously. "It mustn't be true. You are simply too weak to carry the blood of Kalan, too weak to be my heir, too weak in mind to learn the exquisite art of spellcraft," sneered Ordwak, "and too weak in strength to keep your sister from stealing your power." With that, Ordwak turned and swiftly strode away, the swishing of his silken robes fading as he quickly disappeared around a bend in the hall. Hoke trembled with rage. He burned to scream into his father's face, but he was small, and his father was so powerful. How could he fight back? Hoke was startled from his brooding by a gruff voice. "I've seen that look, boy." Hoke nearly jumped in surprise. "Sir? Excuse me?" asked Hoke in confusion. He'd been so entangled within his misery that he hadn't heard the man's approach. Hoke regarded the man before him. It took a moment to put a name to the face. Recognition suddenly dawned upon Hoke. This was Corso, captain of Terransay's force of rangers, the elite scouts that patrolled the rugged terrain surrounding the tower. "That look. Naked, unabashed rage," said Corso. "I don't begrudge you, understand. I'd reckon that I just overheard more than your father intended. And it may not be my place to say this, but you deserve a fair share of the truth," said Corso. Hoke looked at the floor, unsure what to say, but the ranger took him by his chin and lifted his face. "Your father is a feckless cunt. And he's wrong." Hoke was thunderstruck. He'd never heard anybody say a reproachful word about his father. In Terransay, Ordwak's word was akin to law. The ranger continued. "So magic isn't your strength. Who gives a fuck, eh? The old gods know I don't. Me? I'd sooner measure a man by the calluses on his hands. Now I saw that look, Hoke, that burning rage, but not a hateful rage. It was a need to prove yourself, and in so doing, prove your father wrong." Corso silently regarded Hoke for a moment before pulling a short sword from a scabbard at his side. He flipped the blade and presented it to Hoke, hilt first. "You want to take on the world, mate? Learn to swing a sword." Hoke hesitantly took the leather-wrapped grip in his hand and lifted the sword. It was heavier than he expected, but felt perfectly balanced in his hand. Hoke smiled as he hefted the blade. Corso gave a grim smile in turn as he took the blade back from Hoke. "Maybe someday I'll teach you the proper way it's used, if you're of a mind to it." "That he did," said Hawk. "Now." Hoke was startled from his reverie by Hawk's voice. He found himself back in their room. His sister stood beside him, her hand upon his shoulder. "Daydreaming of the past," she mused. Hoke sighed. "It's been a difficult couple of days." Hawk smiled in sympathy as she gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Any progress with the Ka language?" asked Hawk. Hawk shook his head in annoyance. "It's no use." Hawk settled into her chair and conjured a cup of tea. "It may seem impossible, but the path is there. You just need to walk upon it." Hawk put his head into his hands and massaged his temples. "I sense no path." "Regardless, it exists," replied Hawk. "The information exists in my mind. Our minds are linked. Ergo, you have access to that information. It's just data, Hawk, and the link has proven true. I haven't trained a day under a swordmaster, yet my mastery of the blade is undeniable. I didn't learn those skills. You did. I merely accessed them through our connection. It goes both ways." "You just need to find the path," finished Hawk. "You know I haven't the knack for it," protested Hawk. "Bullshit," said Hawk under her breath. She fixed Hawk with a knowing stare. "Don't imprison yourself behind bars of your own creation." Hawk silently considered his sister's words. He knew she spoke wisdom, but his frustration was still too close to the surface of his mind. He vowed to meditate upon it later before deciding to change the subject. "Did you know Kalan had living family ties among the Ka?" asked Hawk. "It was told to me that Motavi Galen is himself a direct blood relative, which makes us distant cousins." Hawk pursed her lips and thought for a moment before answering. "I knew she was of Ka descent, but I've never heard nor read tale of her family before Terransay, only her descendants within the tower," replied Hawk. "We know those stories all too well," said Hawk, "but what of her life before Terransay?" "Let's see," said Hawk. She set her teacup on a saucer and placed it on a small table beside her. With a flick of her wrist and a softly spoken incantation, golden light permeated the air between Hawk and Hawk. The light swirled and coalesced into a book, thickly bound with gilded pages. The emblem of Terransay was stamped in gold upon the scarlet cover. Set within a circle, the symbol's lines outtraced an outline of the tower's familiar profile. The emblem sparkled and writhed with magical energy as it awaited Hawk's command. Hawk discovered at a young age that she could perfectly recall every book she had ever read. She kept them on a shelf in a corner of her mind. As she grew, so grew the shelf, and soon she had an entire library within her mind. Hawk spent hours among those shelves, her body in a state of deep meditation as she revisited old friends within the yellowed pages of her favorite books. Over time, she crafted a magical construct to catalog the many shelves of books within her mind. She called it the Codex. The Codex, she had explained to the Conclave, was a book of books, a construct that the people of Terransay could use to codify and store their vast libraries. It had been her first feat as an heiress to the power of Kalan. The Conclave put the spell into use with scores of acolytes pouring through the many works within the libraries, and now, years later, the Codex contained many of the books in Terransay. Hawk opened the front cover of the Codex. The page was blank. "Kalan," she said aloud. Golden light shined forth from the page and words began to form into a list of books. Hawk's finger traced the pages as she scanned through the list. "I'm familiar with these books. Outside of her work on magical theory, these titles only contain referential mentions," she said. "Others are retellings of stories we already know." Hawk remained silent as Hawk pondered for a moment. "Indices," said Hawk. The words on the page shifted and realigned to form a new list. "Terransay has hundreds of libraries. Each one has an index of book titles and shelf locations. If we compare the indices against the Codex, we can ascertain if any titles are missing," said Hawk as she scanned through the list. Hawk went to the short bar on his side of the room and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He swirled the golden liquid around his glass as he considered his sister's words. "Don't imprison yourself behind bars of your own creation." Hawk sipped his whiskey as he rolled the words around in his mind. He knew the limiting nature of self-doubt. His early days in ranger training had purged him of many of those old demons, but he knew that Hawk spoke no falsehood. She could always see the truth in her brother when he could not see it within himself. He drained his glass and set it on the bar. Reaching again for the bottle, he stopped himself and glanced over his shoulder. Hawk was still absorbed within her research in the Codex. Hawk looked at the empty glass on the bar. Picturing it full, he whispered an incantation as he held the image in his mind. Hawk concentrated with all his focus, but try as he might, the construct refused to refill itself. Hawk's voice broke Hoke from his moment of failure. The oldest books in Terransea are kept in restricted libraries to preserve them against deterioration. Those works were the first to be codified after the Conclave adopted the Codex, said Hawk. But there are several titles missing from the Codex. Hoke returned to his chair. So, they missed a few? Hawk shook her head. Doubtful. Preservation has always been the key directive on sensitive materials. But what of those materials that contain sensitive information? Asked Hoke. A troubled look crossed Hawk's facade. Hoke scoffed. Terransea has always been a place of secrets. I think a visit to some of the libraries on this list is in order, said Hawk. Hoke nodded in agreement as he stood from his chair. Are you going to be around for a bit? He asked. To translate for you? Asked Hawk in turn. Sorry, brother. My other duties call. But I have faith in you. You're a ranger, Hoke. You'll find the path. Hoke shook his head. The path, he said with a groan. Pushing his failure with the glass from his thoughts, Hoke stepped beyond the threshold and closed the door to his mind. Hawk paused before her door. She wished she could do more to help Hoke, but it was a journey he alone could take. Hoke opened his eyes to find Eric seated across from him. The young chosen was resting in a peaceful state of meditation. Hoke stood and stretched. Trouble this morning? Asked Eric, opening his eyes. Nothing I can't handle, said Hoke as he glanced out the flaps of his tent. Ka warriors in their brightly colored armor scurried about the camp like ants around a mound, each intent upon their own tasks but for the good of the whole. Hoke admired their discipline. Eric lithely rose to his feet. How can I help? He asked the Farron. By staying out of it, said Hoke, more harshly than he'd intended. It's nothing I can't handle, he repeated. Eric studied Hoke's face. News of the fight had already spread throughout the camp. He blamed himself. Eric had pulled Hoke into this situation, but it was obvious that the Farron would need to work his way through it alone. This wasn't a battle for Hoke's life, but for his acceptance among the Ka. The young chosen knew that he had to stay out of the conflict. You have my word, said Eric solemnly. Hoke nodded in gratitude. It's nothing I haven't dealt with before. Remembering Kasich's words, Hoke smiled as he added, They're just pups measuring cocks. Eric nodded as he stepped past Hoke. Come along. Galen asked me to come and fetch you. Has the great Alik truly been reduced to an errand boy? Chided Hoke as they exited the tent. Eric suppressed a groan. I hear they're making plans to build you a litter so they can carry you into Karas Din, said Hoke with a laugh and a wink. Eric shook his head and took the ribbing with grace. Since the battle, the Ka had treated him with a level of reverence that the young chosen had found both taxing and uncomfortable, but which Hoke had found humorous. Further conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Galen and Kasich. The Ka Motavi was resplendent in his mantis armor. The black surface seemed to drink in the light, making Galen look more shadow than man. Galen extended his hand to Hoke. Kasich tells me that you are of the house of Kalan, said the Motavi with a smile. Hoke took the offered hand and shook. That's right. Galen locked eyes with the Farron as they shook hands. Fate has returned you to your ancestral roots, cousin, and I intend to honor this. Galen led them to a gathering in the center of the camp. His men fell silent at their Motavi's approach. Men of the Zika, I bring you glad news, shouted Galen. Our Farron guest is no mere stranger among us. He is Hoke of the house of Kalan. Our tribe welcomes him as family returned from a long journey. Kata, shouted Daleth from the back of the group, interrupting his Motavi. He continued in Ka, shouting in anger. Enough, commanded Galen. You forget your place, Daleth. Hoke strained to understand the words, but they were as buzzing in his ears, occasionally punctuated by the now familiar Kata. I am no one's pet, shouted Hoke. No Kata. Galen fixed Hoke with a serious look. Say nothing more, he whispered to the Farron. Hoke fought to contain the anger flaring within his chest. Daleth shouted again, this time in broken Farron. If pet is man, he proves it. Hoke's anger boiled over. Time and place, you son of a bitch, he yelled as he jumped forward, but was stopped by Eric's firm hand on his shoulder. Peace, friend, said Eric, his voice nearly lost in the chaotic din of the crowd. There's more to this than you know. What? Asked Hoke, his eyes flashing in anger. That cunt wants to call me out? I'm right fucking here. Eric shook his head. You don't understand, Hoke. Daleth isn't calling you out to battle him. He's challenging you to fight a mantis. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.